And so today we continue with our series looking at Ruth, and we come really to a sort of a key part of the story of Ruth, which is where Ruth meets Boaz, who's one of the key focuses of the book of Ruth is this relationship that builds between Ruth and Boaz, and then eventually leads to the um, genealogy that we get at the end of the book, where through Ruth and Boaz we get through to the line of David, and then obviously as Christians we get through to the line of Jesus Christ. And so we got it's a really important part of the story, important part of the book, and actually it speaks so much more than just the sort of little narrative that it sets in. We are starting to see what is really a picture which possibly resembles the picture of the church and Christ. Picture of Israel who receive the inheritance of God, and of the Gentile being brought in, really into the people of God through the kinsman redeemer, as Boaz is called. And that's a model because we're brought in as people who weren't ordinarily the people of God, as what would be called the Gentiles. We're brought in through our kinsman redeemer, who is Jesus Christ. And so there's the similarities and crossover in the story and the story of the gospel. And it also is really a picture of a model of sort of the kind of relationship of the gospel, relationship of the church, relationship of how we are with Christ, how we are with one another. And so it teaches us a huge amount. And sort of where I'm going to focus on, because there's lots of areas we could focus on, are the three areas. One is kind of about God's providence, because this story really is a story of God's providence in action. Then the next point really is going to be focusing on this idea of the kinsman redeemer, because this is the sort of the first point where we start to explore that Boaz is this person who's going to redeem Ruth, who's going to redeem Naomi. And so it's just look at what does that actually mean? And when we talk about Jesus in this way, what does that mean? And then finally, really, it's about character and faithfulness, and how that's really important to our witness today. And so to start with God's providence in action in this passage, we're really, in terms of how the story is being told, we're getting sort of two views, like a split screen, as it were, of what's going on, two sets of details. We firstly and primarily, we get the detail in a sense of a human perspective, a perspective as it would be seen on the ground by Ruth, by Naomi, by Boaz, where all that's going on seems quite coincidental. And we get it in the passage, and at least in the version which was read this morning, it was like, as it happened. So it kind of gives a sense of, happenstance, of coincidence, of just things sort of just happened, and it was a fortunate time. And that's one view, and the view, as it happened at the day, that was the view. And it's sort of a view we would, as we live life, that's kind of how we would often view the events that happen around us. But then there is also a second view that is going on. And the second view is really that this isn't just chance, that this isn't just things just happening by coincidence. But what we're getting is sort of the bird's eye perspective, the author's perspective, where the author, the narrator, as it were, knows all that is happening. The omnipresent narrator, as you sometimes get in how stories are told, where the narrator knows all that is going on. And obviously the narrator does, because it's kind of reading back into the story. We know what the outcome of the story is, and so reading back. And so we get this second perspective. And this second perspective is the one which shows us actually this is God's providence in action. This is God making blessing and helping Ruth and Naomi in their circumstances. And so that it's not quite chance. And we see some of this, right at the start of the passage, where the author's telling us, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Here's the author telling us what's about to happen. We would be able to work it out for ourselves. If that verse wasn't there, we would realize all the situations. We're going to be told it. But the author is pointing it out to us to be like, look, there's this person. Keep your eye on this person. Look at them. and you'll see, God's goodness in action. You'll see what's going to happen. You're going to see that it's not all bleak for Naomi and Ruth, as we've left the last chapter with Naomi declaring about how empty they were. They'd gone back and they didn't really have anything. And yet here we see that Boaz is going to be here. He was part of the clan. He's a kinsman redeemer. He's going to be the person who brings them in. And we also see, again, from the last chapter, that Naomi's desire was for the Lord to deal kindly with Ruth, and for the Lord to grant that she may find rest with her husband. Admittedly, Naomi was saying, like, go back to your people and find this, because with me, you're going to be alone. But we can see that's Naomi's desire, effectively Naomi's prayer for Ruth in all of this. And what we're going to see in this chapter is actually that prayer, that desire being fulfilled through this meeting with Boaz. And so we start to see that the Lord has his hand upon all of this. And one of the other things that we also see in this section is the contrast with the first chapter. The first chapter, which is basically a chapter of tragedy, where Naomi loses all that she has, loses her husband, loses her children. And in those days, if you were a widow, a woman left on your own, you unless someone redeemed you, you weren't going to have a very positive life. So she was left empty. And we all know, and I think I mentioned this in the first chapter, like if we lose someone we love, it is a feeling of emptiness. When we suffer tragedy, it's a feeling of emptiness. And that's what Naomi is going through, on top of the fact that life circumstances wouldn't have been comfortable for her either. And so but what we also see at the start of that chapter isn't just that Naomi is empty, but she starts full. They have a full life. And she even declared, it says that she went away full. But the Lord has brought me back empty, she says. Her circumstances were bleak. But what we see in this chapter today, chapter 2, is how the Lord reverses those circumstances as well. They start off empty, and Ruth goes away to work in the fields empty. And she comes back through these circumstances, through these happenstances, as it were. She comes back full, beyond full, because she has an abundance of harvest. She has a meal that she comes back with. Then they end up full. It uses the term that they were satisfied. They ate until they were satisfied. That is to say that they were full. They ate until they were full. And so we're seeing the circumstances being turned around in this story. And part of that comes through the faithfulness of Ruth, comes through the faithfulness of Boaz, and it comes through the Lord's providence over the whole situation. And we see that in the providence, that's, the satisfaction. It wasn't just that she got some grain that was picked. We start to see that she was left the choice grain that was picked. So they had the good stuff available to them. And it wasn't just enough for them. It was a huge, huge amount. It was so much, it wouldn't have just been a meal for a few days. It was so much, it would have lasted a long time. And not only did she come back with the barley, she came back with a meal too. Boaz had fed Ruth, but there was so much that she ate till she was satisfied, and she had enough left over to take home to Naomi so that she could eat a full meal as well as having all the grain. And so it's not just that she was full in the sense of she had enough just to get by, as maybe if someone was given a food bank parcel, they have enough for about 3 days. And even that, it's not like a great provision for them for 3 days. She was given enough for a good meal and enough grain to last a long time. It was a good, full, wholesome provision that was given to them. And so we see in this chapter, really, that all these circumstances, which in our life situation, in their life situation, they would have gone, oh, we've hit a good bit of luck. This is a good bit of fortune. And it just seems to be that they are being fortunate. But actually, when there's a high benefit of hindsight looking into the story, they can see that actually through faithfulness to God, through returning to God, seeking his provision, seeking his goodness, seeking a God who provides, that actually God provides for these people, provides for people who were destitute. And so it's a good story. And there's a man called John Flavel, who's sort of a Puritan writer. And what he describes for this perspective that we see in this passage, he says, God's providence is like Hebrew. It must be read backwards. And that is very true. I mean, Hebrew, you read right to left if you don't understand that saying. So whereas we read left to right, you have to read it the wrong way around. That's the right way around for Hebrew, obviously, but for us, it's the wrong way around. And but it's like that for us. If we want to see God's providence in our lives, then we've got to reflect backwards, look backwards on the events that have happened. And when we start doing that, and when we start thinking about those things that we've maybe prayed to God, those situations which we have handed over, we start to see the Lord at work. But you can only do that by looking backwards. And that's what happens in this passage. We get in the story told in a way that's looking forward. And that should feel very much to us like life as it happens. We know very much in life, we often feel like we just have fortunate circumstances. Things just happen. And they just happen to maybe bless us, or they just happen. And some things aren't so good. But it's only really when we're beyond that circumstance and we're able to reflect backwards on those situations where we start to see that maybe God's hand was in all of this, that maybe God was working his purposes out in our lives. If you ever listen to testimonies, you'll hear so many testimonies which will talk about a time of suffering in someone's life. But then through their sort of coming to Jesus Christ, or through an action of goodness, they start to realize that the circumstances they were in, that actually God was doing little things in those moments. God was doing something in that moment which brings out this goodness. And they start to say that God was, God brought, God was using this for good. God was using this so that I have this, have a testimony. And we see this in our lives. I'm sure many of us, when we reflect back on our lives, start to see that maybe God was bringing us to this place. Maybe God was leading us here. I sometimes think for me in my process to ordination, for example, I wasn't accepted the first time round as I was going through the selection process. And, and for time, it was hard to take. And I couldn't understand really, I felt so strongly God was calling me into ministry. And yet here was the church saying, no, not at this time. And it was hard to make sense. And then I went into, we got married, which was good, but I went into a job which wasn't good. And it was a very miserable time in that workplace. It was really hard to see why is this the circumstances that I've been led towards? Why has it not worked out as I expected? And it just seemed to feel like that's just, life being life, as it were, just going on. But as I look back today at that moment, it delayed me coming into ministry by 2 years. And it led me to, everything that happened since then, the friends that I made who, are a great support to me in my faith and in ministry, I made because I happened to go to college at the same time as them. My curacy in Christchurch Lie, that happened because I was delayed by 2 years, and that curacy became available. And we both felt very much drawn to, one, was to an evangelical church, which Christchurch is, and two, to the Black country. Both me and Naomi were feeling drawn to the Black, and that was what was available. The way curacies work is the diocese just offer you something that they've got available. And it just so happened they had one which effectively perfectly matched what we felt we wanted to go into for curacy. But if I had come 2 years earlier, that would not have been available. And then just over 2 years later, is when I came to apply to St. Michael's. And again, both me and Naomi both felt very strongly that God was calling us to this area. It was just one day we were driving through and we were just, oh, this feels like this is where we were meant to be. And then the next thing we know is that there was a vacancy here. And so we started pursuing it. And this was whilst it was still St. James and St. Michael's. And the reply I got back was, oh, not at this time, by the Archdeacon. And I was like, okay, that's all right. We've done what we felt we'd done, what we were meant to have done. But we were looking at the profile and we were both just about, really, what would be perfect was just to have St. Michael's as our church. That would suit us very nicely. And then the next thing we know, the diocese had decided that actually let's split the benefits, and so we'll appoint someone to just St. Michael's. And I was like, and so then we applied, and eventually we got here. And looking back, even all the way back to the point of that first selection conference where I wasn't accepted, if that was accepted at that time, none of those events, which are clearly the Lord's work in our life, clearly the Lord having his hand upon us and directing us to where he wants us to be, none of those events could have happened. And so looking back, reflecting on these circumstances, and especially if we know we've been faithful in prayer in our lives, you start to see that God's hand at work. You can see that maybe he's leading us where he has led us to. Some of these things which may just look like coincidences are actually God in action in our lives. And we see that in our passage today as well, where these things which seem to be coincidences were actually God working his purposes out, and ultimately working his purposes out to the point of Jesus Christ. All those hundreds, thousand years later, however long it was, all those years later, God was working it out all the way back here. And that's a great thing. And God's providence is always at work. God is always providing. God is always in control, and he is working his purposes out. And that leads us really into the kinsman redeemer bit, and God working his purposes out. His key part of his purposes is redemption, a story of redemption, a story of saving people who are lost and bringing them to a place of fullness, as it were, in our passage. And to explain a kinsman redeemer, they had four main duties. A kinsman redeemer was to buy his kin, his family, who's a member of his clan, out of bondage, which was usually brought about when someone went into debt and put themselves basically into slavery to another Hebrew. And they, a kinsman, that one of their duties, if they were able to, they were to help pay for that person, to bring them out of that point of slavery and free them from that. So that was the first duty of a kinsman redeemer. Another duty was that they had a duty to buy back land that a relative had sold. So via Israel, the tribes were given set places of land, and then that was given to each person. So if it belonged to the tribe and the person had sold it, the kinsman redeemer was to go and buy that land back for the family. And so it belonged within the family again. And so redeemed, the possessions of the people. The inheritance of it, which is the land, was the inheritance. So they redeemed the inheritance. And then they were, as we see with Boaz, they were to perform the Levirate law, which was to marry a widow in the family who had no male heirs, and to produce offspring for the dead husband, to bring someone up who would belong to the family name, so that the family may continue. That was one of the kinsman redeemer's duty as well. So someone who'd been widowed was to be given a life, to be given a freedom, to be given a family. And then the fourth way was that he was to avenge the blood of a relative. It was to give honor to the family effectively, bring honor to the family name. So the kinsman redeemer had these four key roles. They were pretty big roles as a key part of sort of the social care of the day was through the kinsman redeemer. They were to be the people who brought the welfare to the family. And in the Old Testament, the kinsman redeemer, the word is goal in Hebrew, if you're interested in that, is often a reference to God as well. God was often called the Redeemer. And you have it most famously probably in Job, where Job declares that my Redeemer lives. That's this word, the kinsman redeemer. That's a reference to God. And so we see in the Old Testament, God is, these kinsman redeemer on earth are a picture of who God is. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus Christ, who is our Redeemer, as we call him. That's referring back to the same word, really. It's referring back to him being this kinsman redeemer. And actually, whilst most of the kinsman redeemers like Boaz we'll see only really draws from one part of those key duties, because, unless you're really dealing with huge tragedy circumstances, you're only really going to ever face one of them. But with Jesus, we can find places where he does all of these things. He brings liberty to his people. We see that in the Gospel of Luke. He released his kin from bondage, which you can read in Romans 8. He reclaimed an inheritance for his people. That is the equivalence of the land, which was the inheritance of the people. And we see that clearly in 1 Peter 1. He raised up a seed in his name, which is, the church. We are the example of that, and is seen in Ephesians 1. And he served as the blood avenger. And ultimately, you see that in the book of Revelation, when he defeats all evil, destroys the devil, and we become saved. He avenges his people, as it were. So evil is no more, and all that is left is good. And so Jesus is the true kinsman redeemer. And in the Old Testament, we see sort of the foreshadowing of that with the likes of Boaz as a redeemer. He is pointing towards a greater redemption that is to come. And so it gives us a glimpse of the Redeemer of Christ. But also, not just that we have this kinsman redeemer, we're not just seeing Jesus in this passage, we're also seeing the nature of the church. And so we get in our passage today reminders right at the start and at the end of Ruth being a Moabite. By now, we know who Ruth is. They don't need to reiterate the point that Ruth was a Moabite, but they do. They bracket this story in this. And part of that is it's to remind us that she, in this circumstance, she was an outsider coming in. She was a Moabite coming in, living as one of the Israelites, living as a person of God, which there was the scope for in the law. Outsiders could come in and they were to live as one of the people, and they would be deemed as a person of God. And that is really like us as the church, as the Gentile church. Obviously, it has to be a Jewish church as well, where they are Christians as well. But we as people who aren't of that heritage, we are the outsiders coming in, and we are receiving the full inheritance of God through our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. We are like Ruth in this story, the people coming in. And what we also see through the story is that, ultimately, we are not just taking refuge in God. We're not just seeking sort of the scraps, as it were. But we, as outsiders coming in into God's people, we receive the full reward. We receive the full inheritance. We've been fully redeemed, and we will be satisfied to the full. We will receive the inheritance with the full abundance that comes through the Spirit of God and through our salvation. We are a people who are saved. We were outsiders. And ultimately, if we are honest, and when we start to understand the sort of concept of sin, we realize we were all once empty. And we, through our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, we are made full. We are made full. We are given a full inheritance. We are given a full provision. We are given a full salvation. And we will receive full salvation where there will be no more evil, and we will only have goodness, and we will only have the abundance of God. That is what's being pictured here in our passage, and what we can draw on for our own lives today. And finally, to the final point, the character and faithfulness. All of this that we see, the God's providence, the kinsman redeemer redeeming Ruth, the fullness of that salvation for Ruth and the fullness that they get. It really, this story, it's all tied in to what is the character and faithfulness of Ruth and of Boaz. And what we see through their great character and through their goodness, which brings about God's purposes, is actually that character and faithfulness is highly important for us as Christians today. And it is highly important because it is a true witness. If we are people living with godly character, with godly faithfulness, then we are witnesses of God. We will show God's goodness to the world. We will show God's providence to the world. His purposes will be working out through us, and others will see him, see his goodness through us. And we see this in our passage as Boaz, who is the model, really, in many ways, is a model of good leadership, godly leadership. Like we see that he goes and checks in on the reapers, and we see that the people certainly in the Old Testament, we see it today as well, where they are not really caring about what's going on. They leave the people to themselves. They leave their workers to themselves. There's no real care for their welfare. There's no joining in with their work. Whereas Boaz, he's checking in on them, checking everything's all right, checking everything's good. He's even going and eating with them as well, which is good practice. I mean, even today, like you see in most corporations, if you work for them, you never see the people who own the company. I mean, many companies now are millions of shareholders, and many of their shareholders are other companies. And so we have what is a faceless sort of business model today. And actually, I won't go into the whole sort of politics of corporations, but it's probably not the best practice in terms of care for employees, care for customers, where the ownership is a faceless ownership, because it means anything can go on. And actually, often in businesses, we find anything does go on. I mean, look at the post office scandal, where anything has gone on there. That's the sort of thing that happens when there isn't the accountability of leadership, and when the leadership don't see themselves as one of the people. They're not allowing themselves to kind of work with the people. If the leadership in the post office were maybe going and knowing all of their, I know there's a lot of people to go around, but knowing all their postmasters, then actually none of it probably would have happened, because they would have realized that maybe something else was going on. And actually these postmasters would have ended up convicting that actually maybe they were innocent, because they would have known them. And that's sort of what's going on here, is that they are knowing, Boaz is knowing his workers. And I think maybe that's a lesson for society today. I imagine we're at a point in a society where it's going to really be a very rare thing if Christians started modeling what Christian business could look like. But it would be a really fruitful thing and make a huge difference to the experiences of many employees. But beyond that, it's not just about running a business. What we see in Boaz is a kind of a heart for people, a faithfulness to people, and a goodness and a generosity, because in this, he offered protection for Ruth. You know, he made sure his workers brought no harm to her. He made sure his workers left bundles of grain for Ruth to be able to pick, and he also guided us where to pick as well, so that she was getting the good stuff, and also made sure she wasn't going to other fields as well where she could get harmed. And we must remember that this is set in the time of Judges, as pointed out before. This is where sort of the morality of Israel was very bad in a descending way, and so the circumstances were good. People were doing their own thing. People were being harmed by other people because they were doing what they felt like doing, and so that led to people suffering. And yet Boaz made sure she was protected, made sure she was safe. That's showing good. He was being a good, faithful person of God, which in those times may have been quite rare. And so we see Boaz as a good character, someone who was faithful, and that was a good witness to his workers. It was a good witness to Ruth and Naomi. And ultimately, we see that through his faithfulness, it leads to the blessing that becomes King David and then Jesus Christ. And then we also get Ruth, who is also a model of good character and faithfulness. She models how to be virtuous. She models how to be humble. We see in our passage that she worked hard. She worked diligently. She was out in the field all day. She had endurance. And as mentioned in the first week, if you ever look at Proverbs 31, the description of what the valiant woman, sometimes the virtuous woman, various translations of it, but that links to Ruth, and that's what Ruth is described as later in the book of Ruth. You see how the character of the woman in Proverbs 31 is a hardworking woman, a woman who brought about, good things for the family through hard work. And that is exactly what Ruth does in this passage. She does, she goes beyond her duty, really. And through that, she brings a full work back to Naomi. So that was a good witness. She was a witness to the workers who kind of give their exclamation to Boaz. She's been here all day, working all day, apart from a very short rest. And so that was a witness to the workers of Boaz. But then actually her faithfulness to Ruth, we see in this passage also a witness to Boaz, because the workers, have told Boaz who she is, and he's already heard a bit about her. Her faithfulness to come and stay with Naomi, to care for her, to look after her, to be, effectively a godly daughter to Naomi, has gone from just that family and spread throughout the people in where they are. And they already know she's this good person. She's doing all this stuff. And so they treat her favorably because of it. And it's an act of witness. And it's a great model for how we are to live in our lives. We are not to, the Bible warns often against being idlers, as it were. It warns that we are not to be people who do nothing. We are to be people who are active. We are to be people who are faithful workers. And ultimately, we are to be faithful workers for the gospel. We are to live for God, do as he calls us to do, live according to his ways, and ultimately to be a witness to the world. And if we are being idle, then we are not able to be witnesses. And so it should really lead us to think about actually our actions and what we do and how we are. So often in our society today, in our culture today, we're quite happy to sit back and let others do the work. That's just part of kind of our culture that we've been brought up with, maybe, I don't know, but part of our culture is to let others do the work. But actually, we are called to do the work. And by us doing the work and being faithful to that, it will allow others to see God and to see God at work. And Ruth also models how our relationships are a witness. Because actually, through her faithful relationships, not just through her work, but through how she related with other people, through her integrity, through her care, through her loyalty, through her love. And actually, the loyal love, if you in the house groups, you might remember that from the first study we did in Exodus, as one of the characters of God is that he is loyal love. It's the word chesed, which is a description really of Ruth, and it's a description of Boaz, and it comes up a bit later again in the book of Ruth. She shows a loyal love, and that becomes a witness to others, shows her faithfulness, and let others see kind of her goodness, and brings praise and thanksgiving to God ultimately. And that's what we see here, is praise and thanksgiving to God because of the characteristics shown by Ruth in her relationships with others. And so, just to conclude, we've seen really in this passage, one, that God is at work, that God's providence is in action throughout all this story, through the highs and through the lows. God is working his purposes out, and he is doing that today as well. We see that part of God's providence is actually that he provides a redeemer. He is the redeemer for us. And in this passage, he provides a redeemer for Ruth. And that this redeemer provides a glimpse of Jesus Christ, and that we receive the fullness of life through this redeemer, that we will be satisfied through this redeemer. And that is all part of God's working his purpose out in this world. And then we finally see that we are to be people of good character and of good faithfulness, like Ruth and Boaz. And if we are people of good character, we will be witnesses to all around us. We will encourage one another here in the church if we relate to one another properly and faithfully, as Ruth and Boaz relate to one another and relate to Naomi faithfully. It's a picture of how we relate as a church, but also it will be a witness to those who are outside, who do not yet know God, because through our good character, through our faithfulness, people will see the providence of God. People will see that God is working in our lives. They will see that God is working here in St. Michael's. They'll see that there is a story of a Redeemer being told, and it's for us to live it out in our lives. It's not for us to just be idle and let others do it. It's not for us to think, oh, our character doesn't matter as long as somebody else's character is good. It is for us to realize that by our character, by our actions, by our words, how we relate to one another in church and how we relate to one another outside the church has a huge impact on the gospel, because what we do is all a witness to the glory of God. And what we do will let people see God in action. And so let us be a people who are a people of God with good character, with good faithfulness. And also let us be a people who reflect on our lives and look to see God at work so that we can share that story with the world. Amen.